Good morning, California, and good evening, Europe. Welcome to this webinar from our studio in The Hague. Both Europe and California are facing important challenges in the field of a sustainable and green economy, especially in these COVID times and after COVID times. How can they learn from each other and how can they work together on this? Those are very important issues. And that will be the theme of today's webinar. We will tackle those themes by interviewing interesting people, key players in this field. So we are really glad that you tuned in for this 1.5 hour webinar presentation, which will be moderated by Ruth Cox. Ruth, come in. Ruth is sitting in California. Good morning, I should say, from The Hague. You are in California. How are you, Ruth? How are things going in California?
Things are great in California. Thank you so much, Ellen. Goedenavond, and welcome to everyone. I have to say that I checked the air quality index today, and it's looking quite well.
Oh, I'm great to hear, because we hear all those horrible stories about the fires. I mean, if we want to talk about green and sustainable, these are such important times. So I give you the floor, Ruth. Good luck, and we are very keen to listen to all your interesting interviews.
Thank you. Thank you, Ellen, and welcome to everybody to our webinar on the Green New Deal and what it means for the European Union and the state of California. As Ellen said, I am the Climate Kick California's Consulting Executive Director and the former Chief Sustainability Officer of the U.S. General Services Administration under President Obama, and I'm moderating today's event. I wanted to make sure that everybody knew what KIC stands for in Climate Kick. It stands for Knowledge and Innovation Community. And that's what we're here to talk about, is how can we share knowledge and innovation. I've always considered myself pretty lucky to live in a state like California that has taken an enlightened view on climate change. The California Air Resources Board was actually established in 1967 to begin to address air pollution in our state. And anyone who visited Los Angeles in the 1960s knows how much it has improved since then. And the California Energy Commission was actually formed in 1974 to help guide us to an energy system of the future. And they've really helped to generate a plethora of new technologies that are being employed right now across the state, the country, and in other parts of the world to mitigate the impacts of climate change. We've proved here in the state that economic growth and addressing the challenges of climate change can go hand in hand. And we've emerged as the 5th largest economy in the world as a consequence. Europe also has an enlightened view of climate change and has been aggressive in adopting policies and implementing programs to create a more sustainable and equitable future for their continent. They've been at it a long time too. I remember when I moved to the Netherlands in 1988, I was blown away by the nearly ubiquitous public transportation infrastructure and the robust recycling program that they had that we have yet to equal here in the United States. Today, however, I'm reminded of the Chinese proverb, "May you live in interesting times." By all measures, that is where we are. We have a pandemic that has struck more than 26 million people worldwide and left more than 858,000 dead. We have the economic devastation as a result of the pandemic. And of course, we have the increasing threat of climate change and its impacts on everything from weather and natural disasters to food production and public health. Two enlightened regions and a shared commitment to overcome the challenges that we're facing in a post-COVID-19 world. That's what brings us together today to discuss how each region is responding and how we might collaborate to address the opportunity before us, which is to build back better and establish the foundation for a sustainable and equitable 21st century economy, a healthy environment, and an improved quality of life for all of our citizens and other living creatures. Before we start, I do want to thank all the people who helped us organize today's program. Peter Van Deventer, who works in the state's Office of Planning and Research and leads OPR's Coast to Coast Smart E-Mobility Program. Jan Grottenbrecht, my colleague at Climate Kick California. Neil Walmsley, EIT Climate Kick's International Program Manager. Puisan Tam from EIT Digital Silicon Valley office. And Ellen Heap and her team, the Astro Lads at StreamYard that are helping us conduct this webinar today. All of them have been working really hard to bring you this program. So thank you to all of you. We're fortunate to have an incredible slate of speakers for you. To start, I'd like to introduce you to Kate Gordon, who will kick off our discussion. Kate is the director of Governor Newsom's Office of Planning and Research and senior advisor to the governor on climate. Kate has worked at the intersection of climate change, energy policy, and economic development for the last 20 years. This past April, Governor Newsom appointed Kate as a co-chair of the Task Force on Business and Jobs Recovery, which brings leaders together across California's diverse, innovative economic and social sectors to chart a path forward on recovery in the wake of COVID-19. We're delighted that she could join us today, and Kate, I give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Ruth, and just really a strong thank you, as you did, to all of those who helped put this webinar together, particularly to our California team and to the team from Europe that are working every day on these issues. Peter Van Deventer from our team, as you mentioned, is our bridge between the EU and California on many of these critical issues, and just really a special kind of thank you to him for keeping us informed and keeping us apprised of all of the connections between these two regions. The Office of Planning and Research is the governor's long-range planning kind of office. We're located within the governor's office, and we advise the governor and the cabinet members on long-range planning issues, including climate resilience. The Coast to Coast program, which Peter runs, is a critical piece of that long-range planning, bringing together California and EU officials and experts to share ideas and knowledge and vision like this webinar. So thank you again. Just a couple words on California before you hear from some of the really impressive folks that are on this webinar. California is already the 5th largest economy in the world, and we're expected to grow to about 45 million inhabitants by 2060. That growth has historically come at a cost. Not everybody has profited. Some of that growth has been unsustainable to the state and the environment. You see this through not only our extreme heat and wildfires, our homelessness situation, but also increased conversion of our agricultural land and open spaces to development. We really need, as you do in Europe, to build resilience, particularly for our most vulnerable communities. And the pandemic that we're all experiencing now, which has had such a profound impact on how we live and work and interact, has highlighted the places where our economies are not resilient, where we have not grown in a sustainable way, and where we need to change that approach going forward. This is not a unique problem to California. It really is a central question for all of us in this historic moment in time, which is how can we together advance a vision during this crisis of COVID-19, which meets our common goals around climate, around equity, and around economic growth? How can we build a shared, sustainable, resilient, and inclusive economy in both California and in Europe? We can learn from each other on these critical questions. I am always struck by the EU focus on climate finance, on the strides that have been made, on smart growth and sustainable urbanization and planning, and particularly on circular economy, on waste and recycling policies that are really groundbreaking globally. In California, we've made really strong progress across sectors on reducing our emissions through economy-wide cap and trade system. We've made very good progress on vehicles and fuels, particularly electric vehicles, also on agricultural and industrial emission reduction. We have shown that we can grow our economy while reducing emissions. Through all of this, I think we've benefited from our collaboration with the EU in a variety of sectors, and this kind of best practice and exchange is so critical now, even more than in the past. So really look forward to our continued work together on learning from each other and from hearing from the fantastic speakers that are on today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Kate. We really appreciate you taking time from your busy schedule to join us. And thank you for all of your hard work on behalf of the state, our country, and the world. We really appreciate it. The new European Commission, which was installed at the end of last year, adopted its communication on the European Green Deal on December 11, 2019, stating the intent to enshrine its climate goals in legislation, the European Climate Law. On July 21st, 2020, the EU governments approved the most ambitious climate change plan to date, agreeing to pour a record-setting 500 billion euros into everything from electric cars to renewable energy and agriculture. To give you an introduction to this effort, we're going to show you a brief video from Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission. Ellen, if you could roll the video, please.
The European Green Deal is Europe's new growth strategy. We have to act now.
The European Commission has prepared 3 concrete actions that will offer a strong basis for the New Deal.
I want Europe to become the first climate-neutral continent in the world by 2050.
Real benefits include zero pollution, affordable and secure energy, smarter transport, and high-quality food.
A Just Transition Fund will leverage public and private money, including with the help of the European Investment Bank.
All these will contribute to a global Green Deal. No one will be left behind.
We will deliver a sustainable Europe investment plan.
Our €1 trillion of investment would give investors confidence to make long-term decisions on environmentally responsible projects. This will mean new jobs, a cleaner environment, and a better quality of life for people.
We Europeans are ready.
The format for our webinar today is that I'm going to introduce and pose questions to our speakers one at a time, and then we're going to allow for some questions from the viewers for each speaker. At the end, if there's time, we'll continue to take questions from viewers, and if we can't get to all the questions, we will do our best to provide answers by email in the coming days. Questions can be submitted through the chat box on your screen. I now would like to introduce Dr. John Bell, the European Commission's Healthy Planet Director within the Directorate General for Research and Innovation. Dr. Bell is responsible for leading a broad range of environmental programs and harnessing the investments of the $10 billion Horizon Europe Fund. I just want to note that John has a hard stop and won't be able to remain with us for the duration of the webinar, but he is joined by Bernd Breivert, head of the Ecological and Social Transitions Unit of the Healthy Planet Program, and he will be available to answer questions about the program in John's absence. John, please tell us about your role and responsibilities as the head of the Healthy Planet Program.
Good whatever time it is in the planet to you all. I think the main point is that we're not saying goodnight at the end of the climate adaptation that we have ahead. I have the pleasure to be working in the European Commission, which is the executive of the European Union, responsible for research and innovation, where we changed our direction in light of the European Green Deal to set research and innovation and investment as the drivers, no longer the observers or the testers, but setting direction for the kind of destination that we've set out in law, policy and investment for our citizens, for our investors and for our planet here in the European Union by 2050. I was very interested in what Kate was saying about her task. We're all facing into something that none of us have ever done, which is to try and do something over decades beyond a policy cycle, an investment cycle, even a human cycle to a certain extent. Setting a direction. It's a bit like looking at the Industrial Revolution 50 years beforehand and saying, this is where we are going to get, how are we going to do this? And the easy 2 words I pick out of Ruth and Kate is through cooperation. and through enlightenment. The word enlightenment still means something to many of us. So what's very important, my colleague Olivia and Bernd will pick this up later on, is to understand the European Union is not so much a country as a mission. And this is our 5th mission. We started off trying to make peace through coal and steel. Then we built the world's largest market. Then we spent a fair few years trying to put our continent back together again and build the Eurozone. And now this is the mission, the European Green Deal, making Europe a climate neutral, sustainable, fair continent by 2050 is what we are for. That is our constitutional goal. And innovation, research, investment is one of the critical motives that now moves center stage in making that happen. And you'll hear from our colleagues that in meeting this goal, in getting to this place by 2050, the European Union has already launched this European Green Deal initiative, dealing with 8 major policy areas, including law, policy, investment, governance, and of course, research, innovation, and here today, international cooperation. And we see this opportunity in talking to our friends in California as an opportunity to build this coalition of the sustainable that needs to take place if we're going to move forward together. We don't have time, but we've plenty of ideas. So we're not out of time. We're out of time. We're not out of ideas. So cooperation needs to be institutionalized and focused, and our ecosystems linked up so that we can accelerate quickly. The 8 policy areas in the European Green Deal are basically talking about systemic changes in areas from our agri-food system, the industrial system, the energy system, the mobility system, how we do the renovation of buildings, very complex new areas like the restoration, conservation of our biodiversity and the new economics that needs to go with that, and to do it all within the achievement of the climate objectives that we've set ourselves, and to prepare for the inescapable climate adaptation risks that we've been watching with great concern here in California, that we're facing here in Europe together. So we've already got a whole list of actions that have taken place by the executive. They're in place, they're on the statute book, or they're about to be on the statute book. And what you're seeing is a systems change of policy, an orientation of investment, and a mobilization of different actors at national and regional level to do this. And research and innovation is at the center of this. The recovery, as people were saying at the beginning, you can see it in many ways, but it is a harsh message that we need as a central act of this century to realign the biosphere, our economy and society. And we can only do this by taking the instruments that we've got. So as the President has said in the opening message, we're generating more than 2 trillion euros in directed investment to recover and repair and build better, to kickstart private investment, to learn the lessons of the crisis, and to put the means in place. And we're going to use recovery to accelerate and drive, with every means that we've got, a green and digital acceleration in a fair and just way. So what are we doing about this? Apart from the policy level, research and innovation is at the forefront. I came back from a summit in the Arctic last year, and we sat down and said, what can we do now? We had Greta and everybody else protesting in front of us in the street with 1,000 scientists and innovation, pointy-headed people coming up with great long-term plans. So what we did is we've decided to act quickly. In September, we'll be launching a €1 billion European Green Deal call. And you're all very much invited to take part. The idea is we want to kickstart through breakthroughs, demonstrators, test beds, pilots, good ideas in each of the areas that are critical. We want to convene the research and innovation community and try and see, can we win some time here? We'll be announcing this in the Research and Innovation Days, which of course are online, so you can all come from the 22nd to 24th of September. But just to give you a couple of ideas as to what will be in that €1 billion call, it's about trying out at scale the restoration of ecosystems. It's about trying out in public buildings, how do we do renovation so that we can scale it up and de-risk it and demonstrate it for investors. It's about looking at these extremely difficult challenges of climate adaptation that are ahead, notably on forest fires, which is an area I'd like us to maybe work on, but in some of the other areas. It's about the offshore renewable energy revolution that's moving in both of our domains. It's integration, it's acceleration. It's about having a breakthrough on a 100 megawatt electrolyzer in hydrogen. It's about green airports and ports. It's about land use in farm systems. It's about the appliance of science, and it's about going from having an economy to an economy, one that's driven by sustainable innovation. So please keep an eye out for that. That's something that's about to happen soon. And it's a foretaste of how research and innovation moves from being an observer to an actor in the process ahead. And last but not least, in terms of looking at some of the areas where you'll be able to check in, if you like, as to how we build this cooperation between our friends in the United States and California, many of whom we've been working with over many years. We have this great Horizon Europe program, which is about to start. I had the great pleasure of being involved in commissioning Horizon 2020, and the European Green Deal will be the last great call of Horizon 2020. For Horizon Europe, which will spend about a third of its, 35% of its $100 billion resources on driving climate sustainability. It will do many things, from blue skies research to new innovation capital, but it will, in the middle of it, it will drive these new missions, European Green Deal missions. You may hear the President, she will also give a State of the European Union address in a couple of weeks. We're hoping that it's bright and upbeat. And in that, she may refer to these missions. And these missions are our moonshots, which we will use to convene everybody to try and build a coalition, build a future, build better destinations. There is going to be one in climate adaptation and societal transformation. How are we going to deal with the inevitable issues of extremes of heat, of shortages of water, of forest fires, of sea level rise, of public health disasters like the one that we're living through? How do we turn that around and learn to build ways of dealing with that and build society's ways of making the kinds of decisions that our current short-termist political system is totally undesigned to deal with? How do you make a decision about where you place your city or your shoreline or your fire break, or how you prepare for a situation where the water in the Rhine, for example, basically dried up last summer? So climate adaptation, societal transformation. Our oceans and seas, what we call the aquasphere, working to clean them up by 2030, working to ensure that we have a restoration of our rivers, a de-damming of our rivers, a cleaning up of the waste that's going in, obviously addressing plastics and invasive species and all the rest, but all the innovation that goes with that, the offshore energy, the blue tourism, the blue bioeconomy, the observation that becomes prediction and services. We've worked, by the way, with some great, if I may say hello to Michael Jones, just on the off chance that he's there, a great friend of mine in the blue economy. There's a lot that we have here to do. We're going to build 100 climate neutral cities, just in shorthand. We're going to actually try and restore 75% of the soils in the food system of the European Union, and we're going to throw everything that we've got at it. So these missions, these moonshots, will be mini motors inside this huge transition that will take place. So I'll stop. An Irish person, as you know, will never say in one word what can be said in 10, and usually in verse. But where do we move forward with California? I mean, you're very welcome to join us as a last resort in the European Union. We're always open for new partners. But assuming that we're going to be working together as international partners, there's a huge amount that we can do on climate adaptation, on energy, renewable energies, offshore energies, on hydrogen. On the oceans and seas, we're already working together. We have 1,000 research teams in place from pole to pole in the Atlantic, where we're working with the United States, with Brazil and Argentina and South Africa, and we're working to put the infrastructure in place to understand and predict and de-risk and optimize what is there. We have a huge amount of opportunity in the bioeconomy. I would invite California as one of the co-chairs to join the International Bioeconomy Forum, where we're pushing hard with our partners around the world to have breakthroughs in areas like the microbiome, which is the new genome that can drive a lot of the changes that we need in this century of biology. And of course, we need to get our agencies to work together to demonstrate, de-risk, democratize, decarbonize, regenerate, and renew our hope for the future. And in all of that, California has always been about the future. You may be able to help us to work out how do we do this over a long-term period in a short-term world. Thank you very much, Ruth.
Thank you, John. I would like to ask that you tell us a little bit more about your plans around hydrogen and fuel cell electric vehicles, because that has actually been an important focus for the state of California. They've invested a lot in putting refueling infrastructure in place and to incent the auto manufacturers, or auto OEMs, to actually deliver on fuel cell electric vehicles. Tell us a little bit about the work you're doing that could be shared perhaps back with the state, please.
I will ask a little bit later. Bernd, who's there, was actually the chief of staff to the vice president who was dealing with the whole revolution in a lot of energy to step in, and now he's working between the healthy planet and the clean planet areas. But in brief, we've already adopted over the summer a strategy at EU level for energy systems integration. A hydrogen strategy has just been adopted as well in recent weeks. One will create stronger links between multiple energy carriers, infrastructures, and consumers, with the objective of delivering low carbon, reliable, and resource efficient energy services at the least possible cost for society. The second will explore how clean hydrogen cells can reduce the EU economy's carbon emissions in a cost effective way. Now, the detail of that, of course, is going to deal with the different aspects, whether it's actually as a carrier or as a technology that can drive other changes. I think linked to that, and Bernd can come in on this maybe as we move along, some of the things we're thinking about in terms of these huge investment, the Marshall Plan, if you like, that we have for the future, is, for example, to put in place at least 1 million charging point on electrical vehicles and to build the infrastructure in the right way for the right selection in terms of how we use and store and harness hydrogen as a critical part of the clean economy that we're building. But again, I leave the details on that to Bernd, who's been involved in much of the work on energy in recent times. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I think that, Bernd, did you want to add a little something to the discussion about hydrogen?
Yes, hello, can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yes. I can't see you, but we can hear you.
Yes. Okay, sorry, yes. Good.
Now we can see you. Very good.
Good afternoon. Bruce, I could compliment John particularly on, I mean, as he said, on the electrification, on the hydrogen. I mean, as he said, and we just adopted the strategy in June, working across, of course, with international partners, as we see it very much as a huge contribution to our decarbonization goals. We see a huge potential, of course, when it comes to storage, and of course we focus on green hydrogen rather than on gray and black, if I may. So that's of course very important. On the batteries, and of course California has a lot to show us. There are some investors were investing in Europe, also in the country I know best, in Germany right now, and we have a good cooperation with them. What we are looking at is that we want to work across the whole value chain of the battery. So starting from raw materials up to recycling, because we would like to work on a second generation of sustainable batteries, also with the use of regulatory instruments. So we have legislation like the battery directive, but we are also working hard to form strategic industrial alliances across the member states, with the help also of international banks, to build up own battery manufacturing capabilities, but also to come up with regulatory incentives when it comes to CO2 emission targets for cars. You know that we've recently amended the legislation. And as John rightly said, of course, infrastructure is extremely important to show to consumers that when they buy it, that they indeed are able then also to charge and to recharge the cars. I leave it here, back to you.
Excellent, thank you so much. There has been a question here from Victoria Ngo, and she's asking, how do you shift cities that have been around for a millennia? And I think that's an interesting question.
Maybe before I run away, and it's not fair, there's more going on this evening here. Victoria, it's a bit like the old joke about how do you how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is none. The light bulb has got to want to change itself. The issue about cities brings us into, I think, one of the most important problems that we face as innovators and policymakers, which is how does the democratic process work over the long term in making very complex decisions based on evidence and projections and investment? And that's where, in piloting the work on 100 climate neutral cities, we're going to be working probably with the Covenant of Mayors of many other areas where we've had cooperation with California and other parts of the United States to try and develop a process where there will be a self-selecting role of cities. And one of the things which I think is going to be critical to this, and again, maybe we can work with California on this, how do we have a demonstrator about the democratic decision support systems that we need for the world we're moving into? We can't even do basic things with the kind of populist nonsense that we're getting most of the time online on a day-to-day basis. So what would be the kind of social sciences demonstrator that we could build together on how sound, democratically inclusive decisions can be made that can get the light bulb to want to change itself, that can get cities and people to see where they want to go, and over a very long period of time. I take my own city of Dublin, for example. The difficulty in Dublin, we know the sea level rise is coming, but the richest people in the city happen to sit out looking out at the sea level. So how do we build a wetland in front of that that would actually protect the city, deal with the sea level rise, but disturb the view? And the answer in the city that I come from is there was a constitutional action taken by people to lower the seawall because it infringed on their property rights. So there's a whole amount of work to be done there. None of these things will be imposed. The missions of themselves are about, over a very long period of time, building from the ground up, community-based, regionally based initiatives, deep demonstrators, support systems and partnerships, and then out of these demonstrators, sharing the information and the knowledge and the learning and so forth in the infrastructures. But your question is absolutely spot on. I noticed, Ruth, somebody asked a question about sustainable finance. One of the things I could maybe just answer is that inside the European Commission, what you see, and this is very important, is cross-departmental deep thinking. Most people have thrown out the rule book at this stage as to what kind of policies are needed. We start with the destination and we work back. And one of the most, I think, impressive and complex areas of thinking I've seen is looking at the taxonomy for investment and sustainable investment that will be applied by the European Union in all of the ways in which it interacts with money and investment and economics in the future. So there's a very, very systemic attempt to look at what is the sustainability in terms of an actual operational taxonomy that will be applied for long and short terms in financial instruments, in looking at bankability and funding and leverage and risk and so forth. So I don't know if that's just throwing a lot of French sounding words together or not, but it's what we're trying to do here. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and thank you for having some levity in this discussion. I really appreciate that. So I think we're going to move on to our next speaker from the European Union. Thank you, John, for being with us, and Bernd, thank you for hanging around with us because there may be some more questions for you as we go through the webinar. Our next speaker is Dr. Olivia Gipner. She's a policy expert and assistant to the Deputy General for the European Commission's Climate Action Program. She's an advisor to the organization's work on the European Green Deal and the EU's post-COVID-19 recovery package, with a focus on citizen, business, and local regional authority engagement through the European Climate Pact, which will be launched in the autumn of 2020. Olivia, please tell us a little bit more about your role and responsibilities within the Climate Action Program.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ruth, for the introduction, which is a good summary of what I'm doing. Yes, so I'm maybe one element I would like to highlight is the work on the Climate Pact, which is a way of getting beyond the regulation that can be set at the level of the European Union or at the member state level, and to get businesses, citizens, regions involved. And or people in California will be very familiar with this because the Global Climate Action Summit, for example, in 2018 was organized here and was setting a bit of a not a benchmark, a really, really high bar for others to reach in terms of how to mobilize those who are willing to take climate action beyond what's required of them and really use, for example, their reach in the communities to, for example, change their behavior in terms of diet, reduce their energy consumption, all the different options that that are there. So we are trying to develop this now at the level of the European Union and to really improve our communication also in the different member states, in the languages that are spoken to really reach to all parts of society and get them engaged in this work. Just maybe one more point on my background. Before this role, I was working in a more analytical role on international climate policy in the negotiations, but also on analyzing possible climate targets and policies. So, for example, I was involved in the work on the EU's long-term strategy to 2050. So this was a big, actually, analytical effort to show a path that is possible towards 2050. And I think the key message there has been that in the past already, the European Union has managed to decouple emissions from economic growth. So, for example, the economic growth since 1990 was 62%, while the emissions actually decreased by 23%. And we've shown in this kind of analysis how we can continue this trend towards 2050 to really reach zero greenhouse gas emissions, kind of balancing what we would still emit in 2050 with the absorptions, for example, from the forestry sector. So this was a kind of key work, and I think John was mentioning this earlier, this idea that we kind of established where we want to land, and the direction is very clear. And now we're trying to look much more short term. What do we need to put in place in terms of policies and actions and financing research and so on to actually reach that? And the Green Deal is kind of the first 5 years of the long path towards the climate neutrality.
Well, that's perfect, because you set me up for my first question for you, which is, how do you ensure that these policies become integrated into the national policies and budgets and programs so that they actually get deployed uniformly across all of the EU countries?
Mm-hmm. Well, at the European level, we have the, let's say, benefit that member states have pooled competence on climate policy, and especially on this target setting. That's why we always talk a lot about targets, because that's what we can influence. So, for example, setting a target for the emissions reductions by 2030 is the kind of broad EU-wide target, but then it's being broken down to the member states level, and they have to introduce policies, for example, in their transport sector or in their waste sector to achieve the emissions reductions for themselves. So, first of all, that's the first way. So they're bound by these targets actually and have to implement them. Since we are now moving into a phase of more rapid emissions reductions, if we want to get to climate neutrality, we've also put in place something that we call the governance regulation, where each member state is showing to the others its plan. So for the next, again, it's for the period until 2030. Each member state shows quite transparently how they will act in the different sectors. Again, transport, waste, agriculture, and so on. And then there's a kind of exchange between the member states, a review by the Commission, to make sure that what they're planning is actually going to lead to the outcome that they need to achieve for the long-term targets. So this is a very important and kind of a new process that was started last year already, and we've had the first round of these plans being submitted, and it allows us to then check, is everybody actually on track? Now we are in a different situation with the Corona crisis, obviously, and the response to the economic impacts also of the Corona crisis. And as you may be aware, there's been a big recovery package, a lot of financing being promised at the EU level and distributed to the different member states. And here again, we're following this plan approach. So each country, each member state has to show how it plans to spend this money. And they've all agreed that the priority areas for the spending has to be green and digital transformations. So obviously there will be other investments, but this has to be very, very core of this recovery spending.
Would we like to, Olivia, would it be good to put up slide number 6 right now that talks about the green?
If that is helpful.
There it is. Yeah, I think that this is a great slide to speak to these issues, if you wouldn't mind.
Yes. So unfortunately, it's a lot of text, and I think we have a bit of an issue of many names for different programs. So bear with me, but I think the main message here is that the investment in green, digital, and the resilient is obviously refers to, again, resilient against climate change, but also resilient to new shocks. So that this is the overarching goal of the recovery money. And as you can see in it, there are 3 main thrusts of it. So one is support directly the member states to recover. There are various programs, but we also, for example, topped up some existing ones. An example is the just transition mechanism that you've heard about in the video before. So this is a fund or a mechanism which is directly targeted at these regions in Europe, for example, very coal-dependent regions, which will be affected by a green transition. So to really help the local authorities, the people through, for example, skills trainings and so on, to transition to a greener and a more low carbon economic approach. So this is for example, one of the programs which has been topped up as part of the recovery. But then secondly, and the second big box is about how to kickstart the economy. Obviously here you have the, let's say, more classic macroeconomic support programs. And the last one is on learning lessons from the crisis, very much focused on the health issues. But I think the message here is really that the Green Deal program was developed or was presented, let's say, in 2019. The crisis kicked in, but because the Green Deal already is a kind of growth strategy, it was kind of easy to draw on that and to say, we need to continue focusing on these areas for investment, for reforms, and for transition, and they will kind of give us a double dividend. It will help us achieve the green transition, but it will also help us kind of get the economy back on track and in a more sustainable and in a more resilient manner. So that's the logic behind this recovery fund.
Thank you. We did have a question from Pam Hermans about what do California and the EU see as the biggest barriers that need to be tackled, like governance or public-private financing. I have a kind of a question to add to that, a little bit of a wrinkle. I mean, you have something called the do no harm clause that you're using as a way to kind of measure what member nations are planning to undertake, in their recovery efforts, to make sure that whatever they do for their recovery, that it doesn't further damage the environment. And of course, there's also been a statement made that, that Europe is going to only work with countries that are committed to the Paris Accords. And as you know, we have an issue with our current administration that has tried to absent the United States from the Paris Accords, which we are hoping will be changed in November.
Me too.
So tell us, how do you think we actually can tackle some of these things, and what do you think are the biggest barriers, and how do we overcome this issue about, are we going to be punished as the state of California because we're part of the United States and the United States hasn't committed to the Paris Accords, even though California as a state has?
Mm-hmm. So let me maybe start with, let's say, the challenges, and I think you rightly put it in the direction of getting the right finance and channeling, I guess, a lot of the private finance also, because what I was talking until now was really public funds, which are given at a large scale at the moment, but this will also limit future investment, obviously, as we know, because we're creating massive debts in many of the member states, unfortunately. So what we're looking into is a structural shift, which can only happen if private finance flows are also redirected towards green assets and sustainable business models. And we think that this is, in this case, it can really be a solution to move away from brown investment. And I think John already mentioned it. It's the sustainable finance agenda, where we're trying to go in that direction. And top priority is obviously to end greenwashing. And for that, you need to be able to define what is a sustainable investment, what is a green business model. So that's why this taxonomy that he mentioned is very important, and it gives kind of main criteria on what sustainable is. And just to give you an example, so it's any economic activity that makes a substantial contribution to climate change mitigation, adaptation, sustainable use and protection of water, transition to a circular economy, pollution prevention, and biodiversity. Then kind of the expert group is developing currently technical screening criteria to set thresholds for each of these objectives and each type of activity to allow it to be kind of classified. And this is what we're doing at the moment. And by the end of this year and the beginning of next, we will then kind of put really detailed regulations in place we call that delegated acts, to show and to define these criteria. The second point is that this idea of do no significant harm, which is also kind of the threshold that will have to be applied. And finally, we're orienting ourselves on the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. So this is, unfortunately, sounds very technical and boring, but it's exactly the key to ensure that we really get the confidence of the person with a savings account, the pension fund manager, to really redirect their money in that direction. We've already seen, for example, there was a study by Ernst & Young where they looked at 1,000 projects for recovery, and they tried to use the taxonomy, and they were giving us quite some positive feedback. So this is really kind of a work in progress at the moment on how to put that into very practical use, and how to ensure that it works on the ground.
I think this is really great information and something that's timely for the task force on economic recovery and jobs here in the state of California. So we appreciate you sharing that. I think we're going to need to move on to our next speaker. Thank you so much, Olivia, and we look forward to the launch of the Climate Pact in a couple of months. And thank you very much for your time today. Appreciate it. So our next speaker is Dr. Tom Mitchell. He is EIT Climate Kick's Chief Strategy Officer with many years of experience of working on climate change policy and research. Tom has been leading collaborative efforts with senior officials of the European Commission and the nations of the European Union to accelerate the transition to a zero carbon climate resilient society. Tom, please tell us about Climate Kick and its role in the EU's efforts to combat the effects of climate change, and specifically in the rollout of this EU Green Deal.
Thank you, Ruth. And hello to everybody, wherever you are and whatever time you're at. So Climate Kick was established about 10 years ago with a very specific purpose in mind, and that was to address what was considered at the time as a concern that Europe wasn't as competitive compared to the US or to China in bringing forward the ideas that were coming out of universities and building big businesses effectively. The European sense of missing out on producing unicorns was really at the core of the ethos of establishing Climate Kick as a pan-European entity to bring together the best universities, the best businesses, and a whole variety of public actors to say, what can we do to tackle climate change that also allows us to build businesses as well? And so that was what Climate Kick was set up to do, really with three main strands of work. One was to look at some of the thorniest climate change issues, the ones that we weren't really making progress on around emissions, for example, on agriculture or on the way we build energy efficiency in our cities. The second component was to help a group of startups get to market faster and bring new climate-related products to the market. And the third was to establish a new, essentially, cohort of innovators across European universities who would be the vanguard of this kind of work. And so that's for 10 years what Climate Kick has done, and has channeled in that time about 400 million of European public money to generate value of something in the order of 5 billion of follow-on investment or of linked actions on innovation to tackle climate change. And so we've helped grow a number of businesses in that time, supported them get to market, and introduced things like electric flying taxis and insect proteins into value chains, and a whole range of different innovations. But fundamentally, we came to almost a point of significant reflection across our community about 2 or 3 years ago that said, well, is this model of innovation, this kind of type of approach to tackling the problem, one that really is fitting with the climate emergency? Or is it fitting with the context that we now find ourselves in, where Europe has changed significantly in that time and the needs are changing? And so we went through this process of really establishing a sense of looking in the mirror and saying, what is needed now? What does the climate emergency need by way of innovation? And we arrived at a new strategy that Climate Kick has called Transformation in Time. And in doing so, we have continued a very strong dialogue with members of the European Union, with the Commission, with John and his colleagues, very much with a sense of saying, can we together explore what indeed is needed now and what model of innovation we take forward? And so what I wanted to just do is to reflect a little bit on what we've learned over the last 2 years of taking this kind of approach. Now, in doing so, I just want to give you one quick other piece of background, is that over that 10 years, Climate Kick has generated quite a lot of insight into what works and what doesn't work in terms of innovation to tackle climate change. We've almost got a very significant back catalogue of successes and failures, but that's what innovation is about, right? And so we've moved a number of really kind of key tenets of transformation in time to something now, which is about a test case of much of what John has talked about. And so we're very much looking at what does it take to produce these kind of moonshots of social change that we now need to tackle the climate emergency, and how can innovation help us to do that in a way that allows us to look and see differently about what's possible. And that's very much on the basis of the experience that we've had and the dialogue that I referred to. So practically speaking, what does this mean? So 2 years ago, we launched what we refer to as deep demonstrations, these kind of moonshots of social change, which are place-based. And so we said, where are the places in Europe that have leaders that are really ready to be part of this change process, to set, in some ways, slightly crazy goals, to be net zero by 2030 or to radically shift to a circular economy? And in that, we invited them to come forward and said, do you want to be part of a program that says, we'll bring the best of European innovation to bear on that challenge, in a way of not knowing exactly what the plan is, not being able to say, here's exactly the steps to 2030, but offering something that is about crowding in innovation that allows you to learn and look and see. Now, in that, the innovation model that we use moves well beyond just technology innovation. Technology innovation has a key role to play, but also, as John and Olivia have said, we also need to look at innovation in the way we channel funding and finance and investment. We need to look at innovation in the way we engage citizens and to trigger kind of societal shifts. We need to look at innovation in the entire policy and regulatory landscape. And we need to bring to bear innovation in technology and business models. And the choice now we have is not to do that in some ways sequentially or in silos, but to do that as a set of test and learn experiments all together, where we can almost create these laboratories or hotbeds of transformational change. Not that all of them will work, but in such a way where we can see and possibly demonstrate what's possible in terms of that societal change. And so what you've seen flashed up on the screen there is a set of places that we're working with right now on different topics. And so we're working with the cities that John talked about, a set of 10 cities across Europe that are signing up to very fast net zero goals and offering this kind of moonshot for social change approach through innovation. And just let me take one example in that mix. We're working with the city of Madrid, who have one of the largest developments planned in the whole of Europe, the north of Madrid being kind of radically reshaped, with a goal that is a net zero emission development, and wanting then to bring to bear all the innovation tools that you could possibly find to do so. But also in a city that is desperately trying to recover from COVID and the impacts of COVID. Madrid has been hit badly. And the sense is that a kind of a recovery process with a jobs intensive action towards climate and net zero goals is something that resonates both with the climate targets and gives the opportunity for an economic bounce back. So Madrid is one of those places. Let me just take one other example. We've got a relationship with the government of Slovenia, where Slovenia wants to be one of the world's leading circular economy, zero waste societies. And in doing so, we've designed now 19 different innovation programs to bring to bear on that challenge with the government of Slovenia and with multiple stakeholders from across Slovenian society, which is about education and entrepreneurship and technology innovation and policy innovation. And the point is blending all of this together to be a new way of looking and seeing and transforming places in a very different way to how we've considered before. And this fundamentally is about how to tackle the climate emergency in a way that just simply says to us, the governance models, the innovation models that we have in the past may no longer be fit for purpose. So let's try something new. And that's Climate Kick's role. That's what we're trying. And that therefore a forerunner, at least in hope of being able to offer some lessons to either Europe or to California in what we're seeing through that kind of approach.
That's excellent. Tell us a little bit about how the EU is engaging private capital in this effort, because I think that the financing mechanisms to kind of generate the cash flow is really important, and perhaps there are some lessons that we can learn from Europe in how they've achieved this.
So, in Europe, we've had a very substantial move towards considering ESG as part of investment practices in the private sector. The European Union, as John spelt out, has been working on this taxonomy of sustainable finance, essentially what counts, what's good finance and what isn't. There's been a long process around that, and I think a lot of progress made. And also a real appreciation that public money has a role in, of course, de-risking the way private money can flow into tackling the climate challenge. Now, what we're finding, though, in that process is that public money can signal a direction. And I think this is what the EU has started to do very well, in a sense that it's not neutral in a saying, let the market just dictate where the money flows. Private money and the state can provide a signal in that direction. And that the work, say, of Mariana Mazzucato and the entrepreneurial state has been a quite a key guide to the way in which Europe has been thinking about the Green Deal and the next kind of big mission that John referred to. Now, in that sense, there is still a long way to go, because not all ESG and sustainable finance is aligned to a 1.5 degree target, or indeed to the Paris goals. And in some ways we can kid ourselves that it's doing the right thing, where in reality it's simply not moving fast enough, or it's adding to the problem by only seeing small efficiency gains. So I think there's a lot to learn in terms of the way the state can signal the direction of private money towards the type of innovation or action that is needed to support the climate emergency, but that there is some way to go yet to see the markets or to see larger scale flows come in behind that.
Thank you. We do have a question by Katrin Hayden. Are you considering behavioral change in order to support these challenges?
So I think one of the key things that's come from Climate Kick's 10 years of experience is that for innovation and new products, new services, new ideas to really take root and to scale, you cannot do that unless you consider the recipient, the groups to work with that are going to be able to take that on or not take that on, and fundamentally to work on the values, the kind of the morals, the way society works with each other is so important to that challenge that ignoring it means that we're actually really ignoring tackling the climate emergency. So the conclusion is, yes, Climate Kick now has a key component of its overall program that is dedicated to social innovation and behavioral change, testing ways of engaging people in new ways. One key program that we've got at the moment, for example, is to move beyond the traditional channels of environmental action into other spheres, using sports teams, for example, working with musicians, comedians, science fiction literature. In some ways, really trying to push the boundaries to say, what is it that people engage with and what do they are able to hear and act on, and incentivize that through innovation. So yes, absolutely. And I think a crucial part of the overall mix, and one that, as Olivia said, the Climate Pact will also try to address as well.
So thank you for that answer. And also a similar question was posed by Eco Jueves TV. So got to answer two questions with your response there. Thank you. I think it's time for us to move on to our next speaker. I want to thank you, Tom, for sharing Climate Kick's activities and their roles. I'm always impressed by what you guys have been able to achieve in Europe, and I'm looking forward to bringing some of these programs and these learnings over to our colleagues here in California. So thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Ruth.
To set the stage for the discussion about what the state of California is doing as it relates to climate change, we'd like to share a video entitled "The New Green Deal. It's Already Happening in California." So Ellen, please roll the video.
Climate change and our environmental challenges are one of the biggest existential threats to our way of life.
The Green New Deal is an ambitious plan to make America green, meaning dependent on clean, renewable energy in the coming decades. I'm Justin Worland. I cover energy and climate at Time. To find out more about what a real-world Green New Deal might look like, I traveled to California, which recently enacted Senate Bill 100, or SB 100, with the ambitious goal for the state to use 100% carbon-free electricity by 2045.
What we've done so far in California could be used as a model.
We're really excited to see the discussion around the Green New Deal happening at the national level, but we have been working on this for a long time.
Los Angeles is California's biggest city, famous for its traffic and some of the country's worst pollution. But the city is working to change that, and also transform into a hub for a cleaner, greener future. The Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, known as LACY, is a prime example.
Let's take that manufacturing legacy that we have in Los Angeles and make LA the clean tech hub, the zero emissions vehicle hub of the future.
LACY has been the starting ground for a lot of new green tech, like an app that can help you find a charging station for your electric car, and the prototype for an electric plane. You need to go back to 2013, when the state implemented a cap and trade law. That program sets a cap on pollution and requires companies to pay if they exceed it.
Environmental goal for the state of California: phase out fossil fuels.
We are acting with urgency, but when we do those things, we have to make sure that we are providing benefits and taking the most vulnerable communities into account and leading with us on that future, on building that future that benefits them.
One of the big questions about the Green New Deal is how to ensure what supporters call a just transition that helps low-income communities and people who are especially vulnerable. To get an idea of what that could look like, we traveled north to Fresno to talk to Tara Lynn Gray, who is working with the city to launch a green van pool service that will provide transportation to underserved communities that don't have reliable bus or public transport options.
So how many of these cars will you have going?
So we should have 7 to 9 of these. We're talking about investing in our communities. We're talking about creating jobs. We're talking about creating equity. And that's long overdue.
California has also prioritized employment with so-called green jobs for workers whose skills will transform the state and cut its emissions. For example, the state requires that all new homes have net zero emissions by 2020.
When we move towards energy efficiency, you have to put double pane windows, window fenestration. You have to use sensor lighting. You have to have insulation. Well, those are jobs that are real and tangible, that must be done physically on site. You can't offshore those jobs. You can't outsource those jobs.
Rising Sun is an Oakland-based organization that trains disadvantaged individuals for green jobs.
I actually thought I was interviewing for like an actual job when I came in. I didn't realize it was going to be like a paid apprenticeship, internship kind of thing, and I like working with my hands a lot. So I thought this was just going to be another opportunity to do more of that, and it turned out to be so much more.
If all goes to plan, California will be completely off of fossil fuels in about 25 years. But how will that work? We went to the home of Mark Jacobson, a Stanford University professor who has spent his career figuring out how to get there.
It has solar on the roof, it has batteries in the garage, it's all electric, there's no gas on the property. So electric cars, electric heating for air and water, and electric air conditioning.
A lot of people probably might think, wow, this looks really expensive, but could you talk just maybe a little bit about the cost element?
Yeah, well, the cost of the home is actually the cost of a normal home.
Jacobson not only created a blueprint for a green home where all the electricity is generated by solar power, he is known for creating blueprints for the whole country to go 100% renewable.
So we have developed plans for each of the 50 United States, and each state would have a different mix of renewables. And these states would be interconnected, so they wouldn't rely on only their own power if there was a shortage of wind or solar in one state.
Okay, I know what you're thinking. Jacobson's plan would obviously cost a lot of money to implement. About $9.5 trillion, he says. The main criticism of the Green New Deal is basically, who's paying for this? How can we cut our carbon emissions without bankrupting the country? But Jacobson says, we're already paying for climate and air pollution, and changing our energy system would cost just a fraction of those costs.
This is a political issue. And this is why leadership is required in Washington, D.C. And that's why the state of California is not waiting for Washington, D.C.
It's likely that it will be states that lead with investments to both combat the impact of climate change and slow it down.
Wow. So last, but decidedly not least, I want to introduce our next speaker, Jared Blumenfeld. Jared was appointed California Secretary for the Environmental Protection by Governor Newsom in January of 2019. And Jared also served in the Obama administration as the Pacific Rim Region's Regional Administrator for the EPA. I've had the honor of working with Jared over the years, and I have to say that he is one of the most dedicated environmentalists and one of the most amazing public servants I've had the opportunity to know and work with. So welcome, Jared. As the leader of Cal EPA, tell us about your charter and how it relates to the climate change mitigation efforts of the state.
First of all, hi, Ruth. How are you doing?
I'm great, and it's wonderful to see you again.
Yeah. We had fun. Ruth, she's very modest, but she was the chief sustainability officer for GSA, which is, you know, the federal government's entire purchasing entity. And, you know, they spend billions and billions of dollars. And Ruth and I got up to lots of mischief trying to green the supply chain. So I'm so thrilled that you're hosting this. And thanks for everyone who's listening. These are dark times in California, particularly. Literally, the air quality index this morning was 160, which was kind of Mumbai and Beijing combined. You get Sacramento during wildfire season. We have more wildfires right now than I think nearly any other time in our history. We also have COVID. And, you know, as the rest of the nation, we're trying to make sure that we continue to prioritize climate and equity. And I think that was a great video. So thank you for making that really informative. And now I don't need to make a video. So thank you, Ruth. So the question, I mean, it's a broad question. You know, I think we all need to be cognizant of institutional capacity. When you look at any goal, and California has ambitious goals, you had Kevin DeLeon and others talking about them, dating back to the 70s with energy efficiency, which I know you've also spent time on, Ruth. Those goals don't happen by accident. They don't get implemented by no one. I mean, it takes real capacity building to get to a place you can implement the goals of any Green New Deal. And so I think really what California represents is that investment politically, financially, and from a people power perspective. You heard Lauren Faber, who's fantastic in LA, at every level of government, whether it's the city of LA or the city of Fresno with Tara and those electric vehicles. There's a commitment both by the electorate, the local government, the regional government, the state government, to do what it takes to bring these things together, which is moving towards, we have a 2045 carbon neutrality goal. We have an economy-wide cap and trade system, but we have very strong goals towards making sure that low-income minority communities are not left behind. I thought it was awesome that, you know, Fresno for us it's a fairly large city, but it's in the middle of our state. It often doesn't get the attention that the LAs and San Francisco's do. So when you see a Tesla there going to low-income communities, that's exactly what we need to see. So our commitment, I can talk more about kind of how we've had to recalibrate because of COVID, but basically is to say we're about 1% of the world's emissions in California. So we know solving our problem is not going to solve the world's problems, but people look to California for innovation. It's a hub, as you know, Ruth, in Silicon Valley, and much of the state, many ideas come from our economy, our creative visionaries, and they've applied that vision to think about how we can deal with the climate crisis in an equitable way that creates jobs. And I think our number one example is that we've decoupled our economy from our greenhouse gas emissions. And when you talk to a China and India, that's what they're looking at. Like, wow, there's a pathway to economic prosperity where you're also bringing down your GHG emissions.
Yes, I think, you know, one of the questions that we had earlier that I've been saving for you was from Lori, and she's asking, how do you push our economic situation, or given the economic situation, how do you deal with the fact that there may be rollbacks in environmental protection? How are you coping with the budget right now, especially for this next year as we move to post-COVID recovery?
Well, Laurie's question, Ruth, is specifically about polluters. So I want to address that first, which is you do need robust enforcement. In terms of economic level playing field, you know, the folks, which I would say 95% of industry is abiding by the rules. The 5% that isn't acts with an economic advantage because they're not doing the things that we need to make sure that they're doing. So when I was at US EPA and here, the complaints that we get are from businesses doing the right thing. So we're very strong on enforcement. I think in the EU-US context, California context, it's interesting that the California Air Resources Board was the entity that brought the legal challenge to Volkswagen's cheating on its emission scandal. It wasn't a European Union entity. And when I meet with European colleagues and ask them that, they're like, yeah, we don't have the same enforcement posture. So when the federal government of the Trump administration basically said, we're not going to do any enforcement, we came out with our own policy, which is if there's any impact to human health or the environment, we're not going to relax our posture. If there's a reporting requirement that you're going to be 2 weeks late because you can't get an inspector out there because of COVID, we're going to give you some deference. So really making sure that people understand, Ruth, as there's been a Harvard and now a Cal Berkeley study that air quality in particular, but other toxic contaminants exacerbate our vulnerability and susceptibility to COVID. And so this is not a time to relax our enforcement. This is a time to up our enforcement. And then when you look at the communities in California and elsewhere that are suffering from COVID, they're the same communities that suffer from a toxic waste dump, from the pollution from warehouses and ports. So those communities of color are the ones that we need to double down our protection, not relax our protection.
That's great. I think you answered another question that we had from Courtney Hayden about, you know, what do we do given that the administration at a national level isn't taking these actions? And it's very clear that California will continue to take action and to push the envelope on environmental reforms. I did want to ask you a little bit about water because, you know, water is one of the most critical resources that we have. It's a life-sustaining resource. It's a challenge for us here in the state, and I know it's a particular interest and focus for you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing to preserve our water supply and ensure its sustainability and resilience?
So yeah, we used to, this year is the 50th anniversary of the Clean Air Act, but also the Clean Water Act. These statutes that kind of legally defined how we look at our responsibilities are being obliterated because of climate change. So here in the state, we live in a desert, basically, most of us, and water is moved around through very engineered systems. And when we look at our water future, we're going to have more people in the state and less reliable supplies of water. Most of our water ends up being stored in snowpack. We're going to have less snow, more things like atmospheric rivers where you have a huge amount of water coming over the Pacific and being dumped on the state. So our water patterns are going to change fundamentally. And I think what that means, we just came out with something called a water resiliency portfolio, is a number of things. One, you can't look at any issue, climate or water issues, as a statewide issue. They're regional issues within our very large state. So we actually broke it down into 10 regions. The Mojave Desert is going to look very different than, coastal Mendocino. They're just going to be different realities. The second is local water supplies are going to become critical. We spend a lot of time moving water around, but we also pump all our wastewater right into the Pacific Ocean. Doesn't make a lot of sense. We also are wasting a lot of water from all kinds of different things. So the energy world actually, I think, is a great model for looking at water. Water efficiency only becomes worthwhile when there's cost savings, just like there's a return on investment in energy. That hasn't really got to the water field as much as you'd imagine, as much as it could. Amazing intersections during our drought. The number one energy carbon reduction thing that we did of any measure was to reduce water demand by residential and commercial customers, because that meant their hot water reduction went down by putting in even little things like mandating low flow shower faucets. You can reduce the amount of therms and gas used to heat water. So this connection between water supplies in the future, agriculture is really feeling the pinch of climate change first, which is somewhat ironic in our state because many of those are Republicans, frankly. And I talk to them and they're like, the rest of the Republicans around the country don't understand what we're dealing with. We're dealing with climate change right now, and their pinch point is around water issues. So whether it's urban or rural issues, water is one of those things when we come to tackling climate change that is here right now.
Thank you. We have a question from George Liu. How is California looking to pull in private industry for funding as we move through these shifts?
Yeah, so George, great question. So the governor convened literally the top industry folks from around the state to help with economic recovery and thinking about how we build back jobs during the recovery from the pandemic. We're still in the pandemic, so the recovery, I think, is something we thought would happen at the beginning of the summer. We're still all working on making sure we get ourselves out of the pandemic. But that being said, the first thing that we did as a very large group, this included folks like Tim Cook, all the way through Mark Benioff, folks that lead large companies in the state. The first thing that we did was come out with a climate and equity principle that as we rebuild, we can't rebuild for rebuilding's sake. And Professor Manuel Pastor from USC said, actually, we don't want to rebuild at all. We want to refashion. Like, this is our opportunity to refashion our society in a way that is more equitable, that is more inclusive, that brings us to a point where we are internalizing climate and other environmental issues from the beginning. So I think there's a recognition, startling actually, a group of folks that really is just business folks that aren't directly involved in the environment day to day, felt that equity and environmental issues was so important that we did it before anything else. And that issue of inclusion is about making sure that we have jobs, and jobs is about the private sector. And the private sector, I think, is in an advantage right now with a low cost of capital, which the public sector isn't. It's more difficult for us to still float public bonds. Those interest rates are still higher than the private sector can get. So looking at how we leverage using regulation, and an example I'll give you, Ruth, just recently, which I think shows where California's at. So in the middle of the pandemic, we set the world's first targets to manufacturers for heavy-duty trucks. And truck manufacturers will have to, starting in 2024, produce electric vehicles, moving all the way through to a point where they have to be 100% zero emissions. So we can set mandates that then send clear market signals that in what is the world's 5th largest economy, California, if you want to sell trucks into our state, you need to make them zero emissions. And so I think that's the strongest thing that we can do, is not shirk our responsibility during these difficult times, but say the world is on fire. California is literally on fire. Climate change is not some faraway proposition that we can think about, dealing with later. For us, it is very immediate. It's very in our face. Our agency, Cal Recycle, is in charge, Ruth, of cleaning up and dealing with the aftermath of the wildfires. Last year, we spent $2.2 billion on 2 fires, the Paradise Fire and the Woolsey Fire, on 2. This year, we already have more than 2,200 structures that are burnt to the ground. The cost for everyone from insurance to the federal government to us of climate change is enormous. And so the more we can put into mitigation now, and at the same time deal and build resilient communities, the better off we'll be.
Yeah, it's so logical. You would think that it would be more easily understood by some people in our federal government today. We have a lot of questions for you. I'm going to ask one. Where do you think the EU could learn from California's experiences and approaches, and vice versa? How do you think we could maybe collaborate going forward?
There's a lot that we already have collaborated on, and we're in constant dialogue. There's always a meeting, which is in a great place. I've never got to go to it because of COVID and other things, that happens between EU decision makers and California in Florence. One day that hopefully will happen again. But the point is, it's a long held, both bilateral discussions between California and, for instance, we've been in very good discussions with the presidency of the next Conference of the Parties in Glasgow, so the UK government, as well as many European countries. But with the EU itself, I think the design of carbon markets is something we spend a lot of time on, looking at zero emission mandates and how we've created them. Looking at issues of charging infrastructure, certainly questions of enforcement. So really, California, and particularly in this case, the Air Resources Board, the 1,600 people they have really are world-class. And it goes back to people. They are sought out by governments to help with design of projects, of ideas, because California's, as the videos kind of articulates, has been doing it for a while. And so that gives us a knowledge base that we can share. In terms of the European Union, I spend a lot of time recently looking at the pillars of their Green New Deal that their commission has come out with, in addition to kind of the really interesting work that they're doing with the private sector and looking at how to attract capital. I think they're way ahead on issues like packaging and the circular economy. We're trying to catch up, and so we spend time learning and listening to them. Another area of collaboration is enforcement. A lot, when an EU directive or regulation is promulgated, it's up then to the member state to do that enforcement, and that's very patchy. And there's not a lot of consistency. And so how do you make sure that the bold ambitions set in Brussels or Strasbourg are implemented on the ground is a challenge, and certainly something that we spend time with our European Union colleagues talking about.
Thank you. Question from Claudio Sorrentino. What is Cal EPA doing regarding products based on green chemistry or safer alternatives?
That's a great question. Thank you for that, Claudio. So we have something called it's a green chemistry program called Safer Consumer Products. And actually, we're just adding classes of chemicals to those, I think this week. I think hopefully I'm not breaking the news here, but adding PFAS as a class of chemicals as opposed to looking at individual PFAS constituents. But basically putting the onus on the manufacturer, Claudio, to say what alternatives exist to the toxic constituents that you're using, and show us and work with us to develop alternatives as a way of avoiding regulation. So really incentivizing people to think differently. We also, Ruth, and many of you know this, have something called Proposition 65, which is a ballot initiative that required us to come up with a list of carcinogenic and reproductive toxins. That list is now 900 long, unfortunately, but it requires warning labels, which I think were kind of becoming outmoded. But suddenly, Ruth, they've got a new life because we came out with regulations to require them for online sales. So before you buy something from an online retailer, if it has a toxic constituent in it, a warning pops up if you live in California to tell you. And that really is getting people to reformulate, because if you have a choice online and you're suddenly told, oh, did you know there's lead in this children's candy? You may be unwilling or undesirous of buying it. So really excited for that question, Claudio, and look forward to spending more time in that space.
So we only have 2 minutes left, but I'd like to just put one quick question to you, and then I'm going to wrap up. But given California's front-runner position on IT and digital technology, do you see potential for use of digital technology for emission reductions?
100%. So the biggest issue, I think, is broadband connectivity. We're really focused, Katrin, on this issue of, like, we now have a new baseline, which is a huge reduction in transportation fuels, about 70% reduction from pre-COVID levels. How do we keep that baseline down? That's really through telework, telehealth, looking at remote work for those who are able to do it. That requires, from an equity perspective, that if you're in rural California, you have access to high-speed broadband or internet. So looking at broadband as a vehicle, as a way of making sure that that trip is not necessitated, like just the EU dialogue or this conference. No one's traveling. How do we make sure this is the new baseline? The only way to do that equitably is to make sure everyone's connected.
Thank you, Jared. Thank you so much for joining us. I know how busy you are. And I just want to say, on behalf of all of us, thank you for all the work that you and your team are doing, not just for us in the state, but for the nation and the world. We're depending on you. So keep up the great work.
Yeah, and to everyone in Europe, I grew up in England, as you may be able to tell from my accent, which probably isn't still counted as Europe. But we definitely want to keep the collaboration going. We value the relationship a lot. And the final point, which is just to echo something Ruth said, is that the United States is not a monolith. Washington, D.C. does not represent the nation, and California has and will continue to have bold climate leadership, whoever the next president is. But we've continued to, even during this current debacle of a presidency, and we will continue it into the future, hopefully with more wind in our sails. Thank you.
There you go. Thank you. So this concludes our webinar, and I want to thank all of our speakers, our organizers, and of course, thank you to the viewers who joined us today. We hope you found the discussion informative and that you'll join us for future events. I believe we've provided you with a link to Climate Kick California's distribution list, and we hope that you'll sign up for it so that we can keep you informed of developments and upcoming programs that may be of interest. We are going to provide links to the videos that we have shown today, and we're going to try and get back to some of the questions that we weren't able to answer. But again, I just want to say thank you. I think this has been a great opportunity for sharing of perspectives and knowledge, and appreciated all of you participating. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Ellen in Den Haag.
So hearing Jared talking about the situation in California, we from The Hague, from Europe, wish you all the good luck with the COVID, with the bushfires, and we wish you good luck with the election as well. And for all of the viewers, we would say, stay safe, but move on.